Today it is a land of geometric precision, endless golden fields bisected by ruler straight highways dotted with quiet towns. But rewind 2 centuries, and this was not a landscape of order, but of epic, silent scale. This was the northern plains in the 1800s, a vast, rolling ocean of grass, a stage for the final acts of ancient ways and the brutal, hopeful birth of a new world. It was less a cauldron of clashing cultures like New Orleans and more a vast anvil, upon which lives and dreams were hammered out under a relentless sky. Through this journey, weaving together ledger art, surveyors' sketches, pioneer photographs, and the oral histories of its peoples, we will witness North Dakota's evolution from a sovereign homeland to a contested territory, and finally, a reluctant state. This is the story of the Silent Sea. The living map, pre-1800s to 1830, our story begins not with a city, but with a landscape. In the early 1800s, the land that would become North Dakota was not empty. It was a meticulously known and fully inhabited world. From a bird's-eye view, the Missouri River was not just a waterway. It was the central artery of a continent, a sprawling, muddy tree of life. Along its banks thriven the agricultural, earth lodge villages of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. These were not nomadic tribes, but settled communities of farmers and traders, living in vast, circular lodges that from above looked like clusters of earthen bubbles on the river bluffs. Their cornfields stretched for miles. To the west, the migratory Lakota Sioux, having acquired horses, were becoming the powerful lords of the plains, their domain defined by the movement of the buffalo herds, a shifting, living map invisible to European eyes. The Assiniboine and Dakota also moved within this rhythm. This was a world in balance, sustained by the buffalo and the river. The first tremors of change came with the arrival of European trade goods, iron pots, guns, cloth, filtering in from distant posts. And then the maps changed forever. The lines are drawn 1804-1832. In 1804, the Lewis and Clark expedition, aided by the Shoshone interpreter Sacagawea, poled its keelboat up the Missouri, wintering at Fort Mandan. From above their tiny stockaded post was a mere speck against the immense winter white. They were geopolitical tourists, drawing the first precise lines on America's mental map. Their journals described the prosperous, bustling Mandan villages, soon to be devastated by smallpox introduced by later traders. The next lines were economic. The fur trade exploded. Companies like John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company built forts, Fort Union at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri, Fort Clark near the Mandan villages. These forts were not military outposts, but bustling, polyglot marketplaces. From a high vantage, one would see French-Canadian voyageurs singing as they loaded pelts, Scottish factors in wool coats bargaining, Lakota warriors on horseback arriving with buffalo robes, Métis hunters of mixed indigenous and European descent, navigating fluidly between worlds. The trade brought wealth, dependency, and disease. The 1837 smallpox epidemic swept the Missouri Valley like a prairie fire, killing perhaps 90% of the Mandan and devastating other tribes. The map of indigenous power was redrawn in scars. The paper promise, 1830-1861, as the fur trade waned, a new kind of line was imposed, the treaty line. The 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie and subsequent agreements attempted to define territories for the Plains tribes. On paper, maps in Washington showed neat, colored blocks. On the ground, these lines were meaningless to the buffalo and contested by the tribes. Meanwhile, a different vision was emerging. Surveyors and boosters began to speak not of a great American desert, but of a great American farm. The Homestead Act of 1862 loomed on the horizon, a promise of 160 free acres to any who would prove up the land. But first, the land had to be officially taken. The Dakota Territory was created in 1861, a vast administrative box encompassing present-day North and South Dakota and more. Its early capital was Yankton, far to the south. For now, North Dakota remained largely the domain of the Lakota, Dakota, and Métis. The Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of the Dakota signed treaties ceding the rich Red River Valley in the east. This fertile belt, carved by an ancient glacial lake, would be the thin end of the wedge. The paper promises had been made. Soon the people would come to collect. Blood on the grass, 1861-1883, the coming was not peaceful. The 1860s and 70s were decades of brutal warfare to the south and west, as the U.S. military sought to crush Lakota resistance and clear the plains for railroads and settlers. Though major battles like Little Bighorn, 1876, were fought in Montana, their repercussions echoed through Dakota. Sitting Bull, Tatanka Iatake, a Hunkpapa Lakota leader, became the symbol of this resistance. The decisive confrontation in North Dakota came in the wake of Little Bighorn. The U.S. Army pursued the hostile bands who had not surrendered to reservations. In the stark, beautiful badlands of the Little Missouri, the Lakota held out through a bitter winter. The final act was one of exhaustion, not a grand battle. In July 1881, Sitting Bull, his people starving, crossed the border from Canada and surrendered at Fort Buford, North Dakota. In a small, bleak ceremony, he handed his rifle to his young son, who presented it to the fort's commander. The act was captured in a photograph. The proud, defeated leader, the somber child, the stone-faced soldiers. The sovereign world of the horse and buffalo was over. The reservations, Standing Rock, Fort Berthold, Turtle Mountain, became the new constricted homelands. The sea of grass was now open for the plow. The Iron Horse and the Sodbusters, 1872-1885, with resistance quelled, the transformation accelerated at a dizzying pace. The Northern Pacific Railroad, championed by financier J. Cook, reached the Red River in 1872 and thrust westward like an iron spear. Towns sprouted almost overnight at rail sidings: Fargo, Bismarck, Mandan. These were raw, instant communities of false front buildings, tents, and mud. The settlers followed, lured by railroad propaganda promising rain follows the plow. They were the sodbusters. From above, their homesteads were tiny, defiant squares scratched into an infinite expanse. Their homes were not log cabins, but soddies, dugouts carved into hillsides or huts built from thick, grassy bricks of prairie sod. A photograph from the era shows a family posed before their sod house, its roof blooming with wildflowers, the vast emptiness pressing in on all sides. Life was a battle against isolation, blizzards. The children's blizzard of 1888 would kill hundreds across the plains, drought, and locusts that could darken the sky and strip a field to bare earth in hours. This was the grim, back-breaking work of conquest made manifest. Bonanza and bust, 1875-1890, not all agriculture was a desperate struggle. Eastern and European capitalists created bonanza farms in the Red River Valley, some exceeding 50,000 acres. These were agricultural factories. Aerial maps from the time show colossal, perfectly geometric fields. Steam-powered tractors, horse-drawn gang plows, and armies of migrant workers harvested wheat on an industrial scale. The town of Grand Forks became a bustling hub of grain elevators, the new cathedrals of the plains. This era also saw the tragic fragmentation of the remaining indigenous lands. The Dawes Act of 1887 aimed to assimilate Native Americans by breaking up reservations into individual allotments and selling the surplus to whites. At Fort Berthold, the lands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara were carved up. At Turtle Mountain, the Ojibwe and Métis community faced relentless pressure on their land base. The buffalo were gone, replaced by fenced fields of monoculture. The complex, lived-in map of the plains had been replaced by the surveyor's grid, the township and range system. Nature, however, was not so easily subdued. The gauntlet of statehood, 1889-1896. By the late 1880s, Dakota Territory had a population boom concentrated in the South. The push for statehood split the territory along the 46th parallel. The North was reluctant. It feared the costs of state government and held political tensions between small farmers and bonanza interests. But the tide was irresistible. On November 2, 1889, President Benjamin Harrison shuffled the statehood papers for North and South Dakota and signed them blindly, so no one could know which was admitted first. North Dakota, the 39th or 40th state, was born in bureaucratic ambiguity. Its baptism was fire and ice. Almost immediately, the nation plunged into the panic of 1893. Wheat prices collapsed. Drought returned. Mortgages held by Eastern banks were foreclosed. From the air, one would have seen a landscape pockmarked with abandoned homesteads, the skeletal frames of failed farms. This crucible of debt and despair forged a radical political spirit. Populist fury swept the state. Fiery orators like Mary Lease, who famously told farmers to raise less corn and more hell, found a ready audience. The Nonpartisan League, though rising in the next century, had its roots in this era of betrayal. The promise of paradise had become a struggle for survival. The Seed in the Snow, 1890-1900. As the century closed, North Dakota was a place of profound loneliness and hardening resilience. The great bison herds were memories, preserved only in Lakota winter counts, and the piles of bones settlers gathered to sell for fertilizer. The bustling Earth Lodge villages were silent mounds on the bluffs. The fur trade forts were rotting ruins. The bonanza farms were struggling. The hopeful sodbusters were either broken or hardened. Yet in this seeming emptiness, a new identity was taking root. It was found in the determined communities building colleges and churches on the treeless plains. It was in the quiet persistence of tribal communities preserving language and ceremony against impossible odds. It was in the Norse, German, and Ukrainian songs echoing in the kitchens of immigrant homesteads. The 1800s had not given North Dakota a jazz rhythm born of cultural collision. Instead, it bestowed a different rhythm, the slow, patient beat of seasons, the deep silence of a winter blizzard, the relentless wind of spring, the intense, fleeting explosion of summer growth, and the grateful exhaustion of fall harvest. The struggle had forged not a song but a stance, stubborn, self-reliant, wary of distant powers, and intimately tied to the unforgiving, beautiful land. Epilogue: the coming silence. The 19th century in North Dakota ended not with a bang, but with the eerie howl of a January wind over a frozen field. The frontier was declared closed. The silent sea had been surveyed, partitioned, conquered, and plowed. The stories of survival, of Arikara women saving seed corn, of a Norwegian settler family huddled in a soddy through a 3-day blizzard, of a Lakota grandmother quietly teaching beadwork patterns at Standing Rock, were now the bedrock of the state's soul. The next century would bring new wars, greater mechanization, and the volatile boom and bust of oil. But the character imprinted in the 1800s, of resilience in isolation, of community forged against vast space, of a people shaped more by land and sky than by city and crowd, would endure. The century had quieted the thunder of hooves, but in that silence the roots, tenacious and deep, had taken hold.